for this workshop. So we're glad to have you here. This is the 7th Local Food Choice Act workshop that Arrow has done over the past year. So we will be recording this and we will send you the link. So hopefully we can just make sure that everyone that wants to know about this law gets the information they would like. Just a couple of quick housekeeping things. We will use the chat function for questions, and my colleague Erin is going to be monitoring that. So we found that there's a lot of specific questions pertinent to specific entities, and I'm happy to go through those, but we might ask that folks wait to about halfway through the presentation. We're going to do a little shift, and at that point we'll make sure that we answer any questions or have any clarification that needs to happen. As you heard, we are recording this, and as I said, I'll send the recording and slides, and also I have like a laundry list of resources that we'll also send out with this, everything from specifics on food licensing to insurance, etc. So hopefully this might answer some questions and then lead you to more information if necessary. And I have a survey at the end. It should come up right as we end the webinar. So please take a moment to complete that. We'd love to hear your input on what you found helpful. All right. First thing we're going to do is just some quick intros. My name is Sam Bloomquist. I am the Value Added Food Program Manager at Arrow, and that's one hat. I have another hat. I'm also the Program Director for the Food and Ag Development Center at Prospera, which is housed in Bozeman. And I am happy to help you with questions, follow-up questions, or provide resources from either entity. And then I'd also like to point out just some other resources that are available. So Arrow has a long history of working in the cottage food world and on kind of the legislative foundations of this law. So they're a great resource. We have a bunch of resources on our website specific to value-added food production. And in addition, food and ag centers, there's 9 of us around the state. We focus on helping food and ag businesses and producers. And I just happen to be one that's particularly interested in this law, but my colleagues are great resources wherever you are in the state. And then, Erin, do you want to introduce yourself and Abundant?
Sure. Hi, everybody. Erin Austin, Director of Community Partners and Sales with Arrow and Abundant Montana. I see a lot of names and faces I know, so good to be with you all. You all may be familiar, but Abundant Montana is a program of Arrow seeking to be a megaphone for local food in the state. So helping to educate consumers about the value of local food and where to find it, and then really support our food and farming businesses and enterprises in having successful, thoughtful businesses by providing affordable marketing services in the digital space. So we've got our annual local food guide and a variety of digital and marketing technical assistance services that we can provide to our partners. I think that's all I'll say today, but really passionate about supporting you all in a variety of ways.
Thanks, Erin. So I would just add that I think one of the best things about food and ag in Montana is there's so many great people and so many great resources, and people work together and collaborate and share resources. So your local food coordinator in your region is a great resource. They can connect you with folks in the food, ag, or business world too. So, and many of our partners are on this call too. So we have a great statewide team. Okay, so real quick, the goals and the agenda for this workshop. We can't talk about this law without starting out talking about some of the background of food licensing, registration, and inspection in Montana. We'll have that as a backdrop, and then we'll drill into the specifics of the Local Food Choice Act, how to comply, what opportunities they are, and then how to manage some of the risks. And then we'll, the second half will really focus on specific liabilities and kind of what you can do to manage those liabilities. I would say that this law can be contentious. It can be politicized, and Arrow's take is really just focusing on the opportunities, making sure everyone understands the law. Did your screen just, sorry, there we go. Can everyone see the agenda?
Yes.
Okay, not sure what happened there, but hopefully it won't do it again. But again, we're really looking at this as an opportunity and just making sure that people are as well informed as they can on how to move forward with those opportunities. Okay, so stay with me here. This is kind of dry, and maybe one of the reasons why this law was passed is this part of the conversation can be confusing. But again, I'd like to have us all have some basic understanding so we can understand the difference that the Local Food Choice Act brings. So basic terms, our nation's food safety laws are a foundation of legislation that sets industry standards. And then those industry standards are based on an inspection and licensing process. So we have food safety standards. And again, we follow them through all the way down to local businesses based on standards, inspections, and licenses. Who issues those licenses or whose jurisdiction those fall under depends upon a whole bunch of different factors. Whether it's federal, state, or a local authority can be based on the product that you're making, where you're making it, how you're making it, and in some cases, how much of it you're selling. So it's confusing. But in basic terms, the FDA, so the federal government, oversees interstate commerce or across borders, so any kind of import or exports, and potentially in some cases, interactions between other entities such as tribes. So most commonly that's the USDA or the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration. From there, each state has their own food codes and administrative rules that are attached to those food codes. And those are specifically related to health and safety standards. That goes down one further level to counties. So oftentimes the counties are, at least in Montana, are charged with enforcement of both the state and the federal laws. So sometimes it can be confusing, but oftentimes your county sanitarian or even maybe your city building department is inspecting and licensing rules and regulations that might be on the county, but they might also be doing in partnership with the state or the feds. So whose jurisdiction based on product for the state of Montana, specifically for wholesale transactions? These are defined as transactions business to business. So if you are making a food product and you're selling it to a grocery store or restaurant or another business entity, that's a wholesale transaction. And who has jurisdiction over those depends upon the product. So in Montana, the Department of Livestock oversees meat, poultry, eggs, and dairy. The Department of Ag oversees raw produce and other agricultural commodities. And then Department of Health and Human Services has jurisdiction over value-added and processed food items. And then when we get into consumer sales, so whether that's retail or any other direct from producer to consumer, or even business to consumer, anything that is ending up with the consumer is more or less under the jurisdiction of the Department of Health and Human Services, usually the consumer safety section. So they have a bunch of different licensing and it kind of depends upon the entity, but just for our knowledge, they oversee retail food outlets. So that is grocery store, online markets, in some cases restaurants, temporary food establishments. Those are any entity that's making and preparing food but doesn't have a brick and mortar. So food trucks, vendors at like a county fair, any other kind of non-permanent structure. They oversee farmers markets, and they also oversee the cottage food registration program. Okay. So again, that's the context in which the Local Food Choice Act kind of enters into. And then the only other piece of background is we're just going to talk a tiny bit about the history of food safety laws, which leads up to where the Local Food Choice Act came from. So there we go. Okay, so this is like 150 years of agricultural production in 4 pictures. So basically, we have our major food safety laws come from a federal perspective, and the turn of the century, so the beginning of the 1900s, was a significant turning point for food safety laws. And basically at that point in time, pre-1900s, we had most of citizens in the United States were either directly involved with food production or lived in very close proximity to food producers. They were small scale producers. People were buying food from their neighbors. Around 1900, we had a major shift into urbanization of America. So like 60% of Americans are now living in a city, in an urban area. And we had massive industrialization of a bunch of different markets. We had the steel industry, the railroads, and then with that, large scale food manufacturing comes to play. So again, you can see like it's the first time we had canned food products widely available. We had these massive meat packing plants. And at that point in time, there was a very big kind of aha moment on, oh, wow, we really have to drill down into how to produce safe food from these large manufacturing entities. So the first food laws were really focused on like making sure that only food and edible things ended up in our food, making sure they weren't contaminated, making sure that we could, you know, reliably produce safe food from big industrial entities. And the next 120 odd years is a reflection of our food industry. So most food that most people consume comes from this kind of setting. So our food safety laws are built around manufacturing processes and chemical, you know, they're basically looking at large scale manufacturing and how to reliably produce safe food in this kind of setting. So around the 1990s, there's a big tension because even though most of our food is coming from this kind of setting, there's also still these kind of producers. So folks that are producing food on a small scale, selling it at a local level, and those food safety laws don't make any sense in this kind of setting. So around the 1990s, on the left side of the screen, we start to see cottage food laws pop up. So these were laws that intended to look at specific food items that were low risk, produced in home kitchens and sold directly to consumers. So there's about a 20-year stint where cottage food laws were passed. Each one of them is vastly different. So what you can do in Illinois is not the same as what you can do in Montana. But at this point in time, every state has a cottage food law where there is some form of sales that's allowed from a home kitchen to a consumer. Around 2010, 2015, we started to see a significant shift in the focus of another kind of phase of law. And these laws are what's termed food freedom laws. And the focus of these laws are more about reducing impediments to economic vitality so basically reducing the barriers for small producers to enter the marketplace. They're focused on anti-regulatory aspects and just this idea that we've created a system that is too encumbering for small producers. So right now there's 5 states that have a food freedom law, which Montana falls under. It's Wyoming, Utah, North Dakota, Oklahoma, and Montana. So the nature of these bills, by nature, they're a little bit different. So the cottage food law came from kind of a collaborative process. It was kind of ground up, identifying how we can open up markets to certain producers. And then a food freedom law came onto the scene that basically creates something outside of all of our traditional food safety and kind of food inspection laws. So we are now going to drill into the specifics of the Local Food Choice Act. And I do think it's important. This is from the original law passed in April of 21 to recognize the intention of the law. So it's to allow for the sale and consumption of homemade food and food products, to encourage the expansion of agricultural sales by ranches, farms, and home-based producers, and the accessibility of homemade food and food products to informed end consumers by facilitating the purchase of fresh local agricultural products, enhancing the agricultural economy, and providing Montana citizens with unimpeded access to healthy food from known sources. So again, the true intention of the bill is to open up markets to allow neighbors to be producing food for neighbors again. And what the law does is creates a category of food that the law terms homemade food, when sold in accordance with the Local Food Choice Act, is exempt from inspection and regulation. So again, one of the tension points that we'll come up against is that some might say that the cottage food law came out as an evolution of food safety laws, and the Local Food Choice Act kind of just it takes something and sets it completely apart. Okay. Erin, are we doing good?
Doing great.
Okay. Okay, so the next like 20 minutes is all about so the cottage food or the Local Food Choice Act is can be somewhat challenging because basically it says you can sell this stuff as long as you do it in the way that the law says. So we're going to go through all the specifics of what specifically the law says in order to help us understand what's specifically allowed. Okay, so who can sell homemade food? So transactions of homemade food must be between the producer and the informed end consumer. So looking at this as the question of who's the producer, it's a person who harvests, produces, or prepares a product. So let's say you're making pesto. The producer can be the person that grew the basil and makes the pesto. In this case, a producer could also be a person that goes to the farmer's market or goes to a local farm and purchases the basil and makes the value-added product. Or it could be the person that even goes to the grocery store and buys that product. So especially with value-added producers, you don't have to produce the raw commodity. Or it can be partially yours and partially if you are growing the basil, but obviously not the olive oil, something like that. So you don't actually have to be the producer of the raw product or any of the raw product or all of the raw product. You can just be the person that makes the value-added product. And then the other thing is that the transaction between the producer and the informed end consumer doesn't actually have to be the producer themselves. So it can be your entity, it can be your business, it can be, in this case, your designated agent. So it extends to people that are logically connected to the producer. Okay, who can buy homemade food? So transaction of homemade foods must be between the producer and the informed end consumer. So this is the focus on end consumer. So the intention of this law is to be transactions directly to the person that is buying and consuming the food, as distinct from a resale, consignment, or a wholesale transaction. So this is not intended to be able to sell to, here's this laundry list, restaurants, bars, grocery stores, coffee shops, hotels, schools, anybody else. So if there's a transaction of any sort upstream of the consumer, this law is not intended to allow that. And sometimes there's questions of, well, like, does consignment, so what if technically there's no money traded hands before the consumer? Again, the intention is to be producer directly to consumer. Okay, so who can buy local food? Again, the intention is that the person that buys it eats it, or maybe the person that buys it eats it and serves it at a community event. So again, home consumption is that direct end consumer. And then the law also includes a statement about a traditional community event. So, and it does define some of those. So there are parts of this law that are meant to be exhaustive and parts of this law that are meant to be kind of open-ended. So the resale portion, the like, you shouldn't resell it to any of these places, that's one that is meant to be basically exhausted. Like, there's no resale allowed anywhere. A traditional community event, it's open-ended. So, it says social event, it includes neighborhood gatherings, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So basically, if you are preparing something, or if something is purchased and sold and served to a group of people that are gathering kind of for their own benefit, that's meant to be allowed. And then it even specifies in the law, you can actually donate food for community events, but not milk. Okay, so now we're going to focus on informed. So, okay, so something that's a little bit tricky about the Local Food Choice Act is that other laws, the normal kind of process is which a legislature passes a law, and then it's passed to an entity to create what's called administrative rules. So for instance, the cottage food law, there's a law that's passed, and then the DPHHS writes the administrative rules. And that allows for that. Those administrative rules are somewhat more flexible. They can be amended fairly easily based on change of time or just kind of development of the law. So for instance, if the cottage food law at one point allowed a certain product and then it determined that we should be expanding some of those products, that would be done through the administrative rules. This law doesn't have that process. It specifically disallows DPHHS to write rules. So this is an example where it's not super clear, and we won't get more clarity just based on that, the fact that it's like there's nobody that can have jurisdiction on enforcing this. So how you are required to inform the consumer that they're not buying something that has gone through the normal channels. The only kind of direction we have is this paragraph here. So you are supposed to inform the consumer that your product has not been licensed, permitted, certified, packaged, labeled, or it's inspected under any official regulation. So it doesn't specify where, it doesn't specify how. It's just your responsibility to make sure that your consumer recognizes that this isn't a product that comes through the normal channels. A lot of people choose to put this exact verbiage in a place that's the most conspicuous for their operation. So If you're selling at market, it can be on a sign on your table. If your transactions are mostly online, then it can be housed on your website, something like that. I did include the information below is the standards that the cottage food law has. And it's just a suggestion for another model out there. The cottage food law requires identity, which is, this is a chocolate chip cookie, quantity, and then most notably a list of ingredients and a list of allergens. So we're going to come back to this, the idea of allergens in the liability conversation, but this is just another model that you could use in labeling your products. Okay, where can homemade food be made? So homemade food under this law, so Local Food Choice Act homemade food can be made in a private home kitchen. It cannot be made in commercial, offsite, or shared kitchens. And it can include leased residences. So again, the intention of this law is to open up markets for home producers. And one of the important distinctions is that in the law, it actually says people can follow this law who aren't licensed or registered under another program. And this is where the commercial food kitchens comes into play. So the intention is not to allow a person with a food manufacturing license to kind of muddy the water between, oh, I do this product over here and this product over here, or to mess with the licensing of commercial food establishments. So ironically, you know, one of the big concerns is often people are like, but if I have access to a commercial kitchen, this is a safer place for me to make my food item. And I don't argue with that. I think that, again, the intention of the law is to allow for home production. And then again, it doesn't mean you have to own the home. It can be your leased residence. Okay, so where can homemade food be sold? Important thing to realize is that this is a Montana law, so it only has jurisdiction within the state of Montana. So if you live near a border, you can't make food here under the Local Food Choice Act, cross the state border and sell it under this law. If you sell it to a person in Montana and they travel out of state to their home or whatever, that's fine. Like, you don't have, the food can travel across border, the transaction cannot travel across a border. It can be sold, this is kind of, again, one of those lists that it's not intended to be exhaustive. So it can be sold at a farm, a ranch, a home, office, community events, or another location agreed to between the producer or the designated agent and the informed end consumer. And this is important because it does allow for drop-offs or entities to agree to various different pickup points. So it doesn't have to happen at your farm, ranch, place of residence, etc. Hand delivery is allowed, which just means that it's not intended to be shipped. So the intention is that, again, you're some kind of producer and you're selling it to some kind of consumer. You're not selling it via delivery. Technically, potentially, I don't know of any instances where you're not necessarily disallowed to mail it. But again, it's not clear and it's not the intention of the law, specifically in that it's an easy way to cross state borders. So we're going to talk about farmers markets in particular, but the law does include a statement that homemade food can be sold at farmers markets or other community events. And this does include kind of the loose term of a roadside stand. So in the event that a producer has a stand on their property, that you can sell Local Food Choice Act food from that stand, because it virtually functions as a farmer's market. What you can't do is sell at a roadside stand off your property without prior sale being made. So if you have online sales and you agree to a drop point that the producer or the consumer makes an order and you go and you meet them somewhere, that's allowed. To just set up a stand on the side of a random road and sell your products, that's not allowed. And then being part of another business. So if you set up a stand inside a local shop and sell your products there, again, that's a wholesale or a business-to-business transaction. If it's a community event, so I've had a bunch of questions about, so say a business entity has a maker's fair or hosts an event where they have producers come to sell products, that can fall under a farmer's market. And we can talk about specifics of how it complies as a market or not. But again, what you're not allowed to do is like basically sell your stuff through someone else's business. If it's more of a community event where a group of people are being invited to sell their products, again, that functions more as a farmer's market, and that is allowed. Okay, so then we're gonna dive into what is homemade food. So basically, something to remember is, again, this law doesn't like go through a list of saying this is allowed, this is allowed, this is allowed. It basically says, if you sell it this way to these people and it's made here, that is allowed. So it doesn't specifically specify what is allowed and what's not, with some exceptions. It more talks about how the food is made and how it's sold, which can be confusing. So homemade food can be, quote, anything that is sold, as we've talked about, under the conditions of the Local Food Choice Act, including some poultry and some dairy, with some notable exceptions, which we'll come to. So I know that's confusing, but I think it's important to think about, again, there are some specific things that are disallowed, some specific things that are allowed, and then kind of everything else just depends upon all the stuff we just talked about. I don't know, where'd you make it? Who sold it to you? What does it include? So it can be confusing, but the list is kind of, can be inclusive of a whole bunch of things. It can be perishable baked goods. So some things that aren't allowed under cottage food law based on ingredients, for instance, like cream cheese frostings, things like that. Perishable baked items are allowed under the Local Food Choice Act as long as they comply with all the other things we talked about. Fermented foods, soups, meal items, ice cream, cheeses, etc., as long as they comply with the exceptions that we're about to talk about. So the Local Food Choice Act is the mechanism by which raw milk or unpasteurized dairy is now legal in Montana. So the bills were kind of married together, even though there's some folks, there isn't necessarily a logical combo. So, but just know that local food or homemade food and raw dairy are both under this law. So One thing to remember about the sale of unpasteurized milk is that, again, this law pertains to people that are not licensed under another program. So entities that are licensed as a dairy are not allowed to sell both. So you can't be like, okay, so today my 5 cows are over there. They're my homemade food, local raw milk, and over here is my other dairy operation. It's not intended to be used that way. So the Local Food Choice Act specifies that raw milk can be sold only from small dairies, and the definition of small dairies is 5 cows, 10 goats, or 10 sheep that are kept for producing milk. And it specifies that those small dairies can sell unpasteurized milk or cream and sold as a homemade food item. And then it gets a little bit tricky when we start to think about value added unpasteurized dairy products. So, so a value added dairy product can be made and sold as a homemade food item. So yogurt, cheese, etc., from pasteurized milk is completely allowable under the Local Food Choice Act. There are limitations when you start to think about raw value-added dairy products. So basically, and it kind of ties into what we've already talked about. So basically, if you have a value-added dairy product, if I wanted to make raw yogurt, and I'm not a dairy producer, I would have to go buy that unpasteurized raw dairy milk from another producer, and that is disallowed. So that's a wholesale transaction upstream of the consumer. That being said, if I am a small dairy producing raw milk, I can make value-added products out of my own unpasteurized dairy. So a value-added raw dairy product on the market needs to be produced by the actual dairy. Plenty of pasteurized value-added dairy products can be made under this law as well, but they have to be made from pasteurized milk products. So I can't see the chat, but if there's questions about that, we can return to it and clarify. No questions. Okay, good. The other thing to know is that basically the same with the other stipulations of the law. This is the only legislation that has any kind of regulatory impact on how milk is tested or any kind of requirements for the product itself. So the state has put out kind of a best practice guide, and the law itself does, I think it's a 6-month testing requirements for a couple of different things. So there are some minimum testing and record keeping requirements written into the law, but that's all there is. And until there's other legislation on it, that's the only kind of regulatory aspects to raw milk. Well, I will revisit it at the very end of the presentation, but Arrow last year did do a couple of trainings on raw milk production, and we have resources and some good contacts for folks that might be interested in managing production risk for that product. Okay, so we have the Local Food Choice Act. We kind of got raw dairy in the mix, and then we also got a poultry exemption into the same bill. So from my understanding, what the Local Food Choice Act is, it took the 1,000 bird exemption, which is an exemption that was already in existing, and kind of wrote it into this law. So just like you can make homemade food, like we talked about, including raw dairy from a small dairy, you can also produce poultry as long as you're under a certain threshold of number of animals. So you can sell poultry under the Local Food Choice Act if you produce less than 1,000 birds a year on your premises with no other poultry products. And then it has minimum standards. So sanitary processing standards, record keeping, and you sell them direct to a consumer. And again, this is allowed without inspection from the Department of Livestock. I will also, there's a reference at the end of this presentation. Mission Mountain Food Enterprise Center and I believe the Montana Poultry Growers Cooperative are doing a training specific to what exactly sanitary processing standards means and what exactly record keeping standards are. And that's actually next week. So again, I have a link to that in the end of this workshop. But so the other tricky piece of poultry comes in understanding value-added products with the poultry exemption. So it's basically analogous to the raw milk piece. So the question often comes up, okay, so if I can produce poultry under this exemption, can I produce poultry value-added poultry products as well? And it's kind of the same answer. Yes, if you were the primary poultry producer. So chicken stock, any kind of chicken enchiladas, etc. Those kind of products are allowed under the Local Food Choice Act if you are the person that is operating and slaughtering under the 1,000 bird exemption. Otherwise, you are not allowed to utilize any poultry products that you purchase to make a value-added product, including bouillon, stock, etc. Again, they can be made, but you have to be the person growing the birds. And that leads to the other major exception under the Local Food Choice Act is meat. So again, anything, as long as you make it and sell it as we ask, including raw milk and poultry. And then the major exception is it can't include meat. So we've had lots of interesting questions about what is specifically do we define as meat? And meat is defined as basically the flesh of any animal. So that includes wild game. It includes fowl, fish, rodents, any basic, there's some question about whether it includes shrimp or not, but basically includes any meat item, whether it domestic or wild, is not allowed to be included as an ingredient in something made and sold under this law, with the exception of if you're producing poultry under the 1,000 bird exemption.
Quick clarifying question, Sam.
Yep.
You've been so clear. I've never heard of this, but Brian asks, can rabbits be included in the poultry? The 1,000 bird exemption?
Okay, so my answer until the past week would have been no. That being said, this will come up specifically with rabbits, and then a couple of other points. So the Local Food Choice Act was passed in 2021, and it was amended in the legislature that just concluded. And I have yet to get clarification on parts of that, the new amendments. So Brian, if you can make sure we have your name. I believe that there was something was specifically addressed with rabbits in the amendment. So I am waiting on a couple of clarifying points from DPHHS on what the implications of the new amendments are. So I will find out if it includes rabbit now or not. But unless there wasn't a previous amendment, rabbit would be excluded, as with every other kind of meat possible. Okay. The other major exceptions to note are anything that falls under somebody else's jurisdiction. So there's a whole bunch of food products that have other kind of legislative rules, and that's based on either basically either mostly ingredient items. So for instance, nothing can be made or sold under the Local Food Choice Act that includes ingredients that are not generally recognized as safe. So that GRAS items, as they're called, are it's basically an FDA enforcement of basically you can't put stuff in food that's not considered safe. And those are typically any kind of contaminants, but they also include most often it's like food additives that were in food and then were deemed unsafe. So it's specific coloring agents and et cetera. So it's not stuff that you typically think about as a small scale home food producer. But I do include the GRAS list, so things that are considered food items in our resource list. Alcohol, the Local Food Choice Act doesn't change any of the laws pertaining to food items in relation to alcohol. So basically, you're not allowed to make and sell food items with a significant amount of alcohol without falling under the jurisdiction of the Department of Revenue. So I tell people that a good standard to follow is the cottage food law. So there are food items that have alcohol as an ingredient. It's minor and it's often, there's a cook step, which basically the alcohol evaporates. So the intention of this law is to not make any kind of workaround around the Department of Revenue's restrictions on alcohol in food. No surprise. It's also not intended to be a workaround around laws relating to cannabis or CBD. So again, those are under the Department of Revenue's jurisdiction. So anything with cannabis and anything with added CBD oil, it's same old, same old. It's not, the Local Food Choice Act does not change anything. So industrial hulled hemp seeds are allowed in food items. And the Local Food Choice Act doesn't change anything in relation to either of those items. Same with dietary supplements, nutrition claims. Again, the FDA has rules on what you can claim your food item does, and those aren't changed by the Local Food Choice Act. I include the Food and Cosmetic Act in our resource pages if you have questions about that. And then with a notable exception for farmers markets, which we will come back to in just a minute. So the other thing that we can go down a rabbit hole if we need to, so I'll address this, and if people have clarifying questions, we can come back to those. But another tricky piece is high-risk foods. So this is specifically in relation to canned food items. So, so the Food Safety Modernization Act, 2015, I believe it was an attempt to kind of update some of our food safety laws. And in that law, it allows the FDA to designate certain food items and take jurisdiction over them. So those food items are ones that have a historic record of public safety health incidents that are severe and a high likelihood. So among those are canned food items. So specific canned food items. And in that basically the FDA has the jurisdiction to just make sure that there's process control, which is like oversight into how those food items are made, and then record keeping, and a rapid recall. So that in the event they say, hey, these food items, people get botulism, they die from it. We know that. So we want to make sure that those products are made safe. And when they are made, we want to make sure that we can go find them and stop an outbreak as soon as possible. So the tricky piece is just understanding that not all canned food falls under this jurisdiction. It's specifically acidified and low acid canned foods. So there's probably people that know a lot more about this than me, but basically high acid canned foods are food items that the pH of the end product and the water activity of the end product makes them inherently more safe. So those are commonly jams and jellies with a certain amount of sugar, certain pickled products that have a certain pH. So anything in that high acid, that's stuff that you likely could have gotten a cottage food law registration anyway. Let me strike that from the record. Pickled, you can't get a cottage food law registration for any pickled products. So those are high acid can items. Then we come to acidified foods. So acidified foods are things that have vinegar added or some kind of acid added to bring the pH low enough to be safe. And or low acid canned foods. And those are things like salsas, green beans, canned tomatoes. Like those are things that the pH of the finished product is variable and not necessarily safe. So if you want to make acidified, so a pickle, a fermented food product, or something that has a low acid content, you can make them under this law if they are refrigerated. If you are trying to make either acidified or a low acid canned shelf stable food product, basically the FDA has jurisdiction and they don't want you to do it. They would prefer that you go through the normal process and make sure that you have basically a license to do it. But they only have jurisdiction if you are using products that enter interstate commerce. So we have a state law that says you can do it. The FDA doesn't really like that. So their approach has been, you can do it as long as you're not using anything that entered interstate commerce. So vinegar, sugar, spices, any kind of food product. If you're trying to make a shelf-stable, low-acid canned product, you virtually need to do it. I don't know that you can do it, actually. So the intention is that you go through the normal processing to get a license for those products. And then if you want to make those products, they need to be refrigerated. If they're refrigerated, it's not a high risk and you're allowed to make them and sell them under this law. I'm waiting, pausing for any clarification questions on that one.
None in the chat yet. We
Okay.
do have a separate question, not related to canned foods, that says, would extracts be acceptable as it does contain, I actually don't know how to pronounce this, ETOH?
Oh, ethanol, alcohol, basically. That's a good question. So from what I can recall, if you are making them and selling them without nutrition claims, then you don't have to worry about bumping up against the Food and Cosmetic Act. I think if you are making them and selling them as an extract and not a food item, I don't know that you're gonna cause the ire of the Department of Revenue. So I think I can find out. I think the best answer to that is the Local Food Choice Act isn't intended to change the laws that already exist about supplements and any kind of food or cosmetic or nutrition supplements. So if there's another law and it's under jurisdiction of the Department of Revenue saying that you can't, this law would not change that. I don't know if that's a good answer. But I'm happy to follow up specifically with that.
Great. We're starting to get a few other questions that are kind of like business specific.
Okay.
And if this is the right time, there's one that's about fermented hot sauces and then a few others. So happy to ask them now, or we can wait a minute.
Let me look real quick. I think that let me touch on the farmer's market real fast, and then we can kind of dive into some specific questions. So the other kind of tricky and contentious piece of this law is that the Local Food Choice Act was passed. And sometimes when a law is passed, in the actual legislation, it goes in and specifically changes another law that might be conflicting that's already on the books. And this law didn't do that. And the point where it specifically gets a little bit tricky is the Local Food Choice Act does reference these products can be sold at farmers markets, but we have an existing farmers market law that is a separate statute and has conflicting rules in it. So just to clarify, the existing Montana farmers market law states that basically farmers markets, vendors can only sell non-hazardous food items. And any food that's made on site has to include temporary food permits. So that limits, it's kind of the same threshold. Well, it says non-hazardous food items and raw agricultural products, including whole shell eggs and honey. So it's basically the same kind of standard of the cottage food law. So you can basically make and sell like bakery items that you kind of can't mess up. You kind of can't, it's not a high risk food item. So the Local Food Choice Act eliminates that requirement. And so what we had in the past couple of years is just a conflict between which one are we allowed, what can farmers markets say, what do vendors, what are vendors allowed to? And up until this legislature, basically a farmers market could choose to follow one law or the other, and both are legal and fine. So a farmers market could choose to follow the farmers market statute and say, we're going to limit our food items to these items, or they could choose, they could say, hey, the Local Food Choice Act allows these items and we're going to allow them as well. It was amended a little bit in the 2023 law, and DPHS is currently working with legal counsel on just making sure that they understand the implications of the new law, and they will be re-releasing their farmers market guidelines. My understanding up to this point, which again, I'm trying to say is not official or is a potential preliminary understanding of it, is that the 2023 amendments took out the allowance for certain markets to not allow Local Food Choice Act. So farmers markets that are public entities, so they're run by the county, so cannot disallow, there's a double negative there, need to allow Local Food Choice Act vendors. The caveat and the question that's still at play is if a private farmers market. So a lot of farmers markets out there are their own nonprofit entity, and they have their own governing structure, their own business license, their own insurance. As my preliminary understanding is that those markets can still make their own rules. So it's my understanding that a private farmers market could still say, we're going to follow the old law, or we're only going to allow vendors, or we're not going to allow certain high risk items at our market out of their own liability protection. So, so basically what you would need to do as a vendor or as a market, as a vendor, you need to just contact your farmers market and see where they're at with their allowance for different food items. Or a farmer's market, which we'll talk about in the liability section, might allow certain food items, but they might require a certain level of insurance. So those are both options. And again, I think that the hope is that there'll be some clarity before our farmer's market season ramps up entirely. And I will be happy to make sure that that up-to-date information gets out to folks that were on this workshop. So just real quick summary. Again, tricky piece is you just need to make sure you're complying by all the stipulations of the law. It does include raw milk and poultry and excludes specific items. And just to remember, it doesn't change existing, other existing food laws. And with that, Erin, do we have some questions that we need to do right now?
Yeah, let's do two, let's do three right now. Two are specifically asking about canned foods again.
Okay.
So first one is, I'm going to add, is it okay to make and sell fermented hot sauces that are refrigerated and low pH, but they're not cooked to kill the beneficial probiotics?
Yeah, so this law doesn't require any kind of process evaluation. So there's no like HACCP or cook step or food safety oversight if you're selling a refrigerated product. The only time it is going to catch, and you know, so much of this is like the times at which the products are a high risk enough that they're going to catch the attention of an entity that has some kind of you know, jurisdiction or desire to make sure that no one's getting sick. So county sanitarian, FDA inspector. So again, those right now, the thresholds are the high risk items, and that is a shelf stable item, not a refrigerated.
Awesome. And I think, you know, that answer speaks to this question too, but just for everyone's peace of mind, Virginia asks, may I clarify, I could make products from the vegetables I grow in my kitchen, garden plus kitchen, I imagine, such as salsa, pasta sauce, pickles, and sauerkraut, if I label them as having to be refrigerated?
Oh, yes. So, two parts to that, and you sell them all the other stuff. So again, the product limitation is one thing, and then like how you sell them and who you sell them to and all those other, as long as you're complying by all those other requirements. And then we might come back to this. You need to label them that the consumer needs to know that they weren't inspected or blah, 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 you know, like you're producing them outside the normal flows of food. And then they need to be labeled with keep refrigerated. And then we'll talk about this in food safety. You need to make sure that like you're refrigerating them. Like they need to actually be refrigerated by you and sold as a cold product to the consumer. So if you were actually canning it and saying, keep refrigerated, and that won't comply by the standard by which it is a refrigerated product. Does that make sense?
Right. You actually have to refrigerate it yourself before you sell it to the consumer, who then also needs to refrigerate it.
Yep.
Last question is more on the process end of things. So question is, am I understanding that if I am an established business with a wholesale food license for raw honey, then they cannot sell items under the law, under this law, the Montana Local Food Choice Act, directly to the consumer? They're not wishing to sell them as wholesale food items.
I'd have to actually drill down into that one a little bit more. I think the biggest, the times that I've clarified this issue is when you're trying to sell the same product. So, if you are making a processed honey product, I don't know enough about, so if there's a whipped honey, or I know that there are some honey products that are considered processed, that would be one that you'd probably want to be careful with. If you want to make a salad mix or wedding cakes, or something that's totally unrelated to your wholesale license, that would probably be more of a reasonable combo. And then I think you would just need to be cognizant and careful of if the space in which you're making the Local Food Choice Act items doesn't jeopardize the licensing for your manufacturing wherever you're making your honey. So I don't know enough about your honey product to know if that includes a commercial kitchen or an on-site commercial space.
Yeah, I dropped your email in the chat, and Kavita just said this would be a turmeric tonic. Honey is an ingredient in it, and they make it in their kitchen.
I don't think that would be a problem, but I would be happy. Sometimes what I found in these workshops is that people enjoy having someone else go ask the question, and I'm happy to do that. So if you want to shoot me an email, I'm happy to try to figure out how that might comply with your current licensing.
Awesome. Thank you there. And one last question. Could you speak a little bit more? Could you help clarify the definition of a designated agent?
Yes. So it's not totally specified in the law. The clarification that I have gotten is like, anyone that's like logically connected to your entity. So, if you're a farmer, if you're a rancher, and you have family members, or it could probably go even as far as like a neighbor, it's basically a person that you're designating is doing the act of the transfer of goods. Where it wouldn't work is if like you're selling your stuff to your friend who then resells it to somebody else, or if you're like if you're really trying to push the limit of a consignment transaction, that's when you need to be careful. So a designated agent wouldn't count as another business, or so like Western Montana Growers Co-op or Root Cellar or like Yellowstone Valley Food Hub. It's not intended to extend to like what's considered some other kind of formal transaction. Does that?
Yeah, no follow-ups there yet. So thanks.
Okay, I'm gonna plug along here. Happy to return to specific questions. So we're gonna we're going to jump from the like nitty gritty of the law to just thinking about liability. I put this slide together, and then we'll see in the next one. I just wanted to really accentuate the point that so in wholesale, cottage food, and then kind of what homemade foods look like in terms of these levels of review. So a facility inspection is like, you know, if anyone's ever gone through a commercial licensing inspection of a kitchen, it is like exhaustive and crazy and all the things. But all those things minimize the risk that is likely to introduce food safety issues to your food product. So wholesale retail licensing include facility inspection. Cottage food law, it's not so much. They'll ask you about your flow of food. They'll ask you about your water sanitation, kind of some of the big things. And just to point out, wholesale food, nobody's looking at your kitchen at all. Nobody's going to ensure anything about your facility. Process review, it's kind of the same thing. There's graduated as we look at these different laws. So a process review in your wholesale and retail food, it can be a like super detailed HACCP plans. It can be really extensive documentation on your sourcing of your ingredients. In cottage food, you basically write a summary of things, and they kind of look through and they you know, oh, we should maybe follow up about this particular food item or how they're addressing this potential risk. And again, homemade food doesn't have any of that review. And then also pointing out labeling requirements. Again, we're all pretty used to the fact that like food in a normal retail setting often will include lists of ingredients and allergens. It's required in cottage food, and then again, it's not required at all in homemade food. And this is a summary of that. So the whole point of this piece is to recognize that for as exhaustive and hard and challenging and confusing that all those food safety laws are, they systematically reduce risk in the outcome of your food products. So what a great opportunity we have to have all this economic growth where people can make food outside of all those kind of arduous regulations. But you have to go into it with full understanding that eliminating all the structure that eliminate those risks puts all the individual responsibility on minimizing those risks on you. So the state is not coming in and like reviewing your location or your processes or anything else. And it can be a great opportunity if you manage the liability and the risk accordingly. One of my like heartfelt feelings about this law is this is such a great opportunity to increase, you know, neighbor to neighbor transactions and bolster our local economies. But I do not want anyone to lose their farm over a food item that gets someone sick. Okay, so just wanting to like do some lovely background on legal liability. So with this law, just understanding that allowable and liable are two separate things. So again, you are allowed and legally able to make all these high-risk food items and sell them to people. It does not change the liability if someone gets sick at all. You can't go back and say, well, this law allows me to do it. It doesn't change your liability at all. So to go through just kind of the basic understanding of foodborne illness and food safety in terms of legal liability. Any kind of incident that's related to foodborne illness is not necessarily, it's not a criminal occurrence, it's a civil occurrence. So basically, you will not be charged with a crime for making someone ill. You would be charged, a civil suit would be brought against you. So all foodborne illness kind of falls under the same umbrella as product safety law. So, you know, making toys that malfunction, automobiles that have recalls, it's kind of the same concept. If you make a product that causes an injury against someone, the recourse that they have is through the civil system. They come to a judge and a jury and they say, I bought this product, I experienced this injury, I'm claiming that this person is responsible. These are the damages that I have incurred based on this product, and this is the compensation that I'm asking for. So when thinking about food safety and foodborne illness, the liability falls under this kind of question of negligence. So food and ag law are somewhat similar. Producers have the duty to act with reasonable care, or like any average producer would, to prevent the food that they sell from being contaminated. So there's kind of two things to highlight. One is, the question is, did the producer act reasonably? And is this how an average producer would act? So the question is, can you demonstrate based on your actions that you acted reasonably and are complying with standard best practice in safe food production and how an average consumer would expect? So the thing to point out here is that, again, you're not being judged by a jury of your peers. You're not being judged by a jury of producers that understand, you know, kind of some of the inherent risks with food. You're being judged by average consumers, a jury of normal people, and their standard is what your actions are being judged against. So is it reasonable to make a food product without complying by kind of what's standard best practice in food safety? And from, you know, what we can see from case law with foodborne illness is most people expect that even though this law is not telling you you have to comply by these best practices, or like what our standard food safety requirements are, most people are expecting that you do. And this, I think a good example to think about this too is with labeling ingredients and allergens. So this law does not tell you that you have to, so you make some cookies and you sell them at the farmer's market. This law doesn't say that you have to label that they have peanuts in them. But in the event that someone consumes your product, just knowing that the judgment is like what most people expect, what a jury would expect in terms of these food safety practices. So important to think about. What's expected might be what is required when you're asking a jury of 12 people. A couple of other points to think about with food safety liability. So Montana is a state that has contributive fault rules. So, so say you were selling a product, so say you're selling a refrigerated pickled product. say it's a salsa and it says refrigerate it, and you take it to the market and it's refrigerated till the point of sale, and then the consumer puts it on their shelf and doesn't refrigerate it. So a contributive fault would look at the actions of both the producer and the consumer, and they can split an issue. Say they were like, yeah, you should have labeled that better, or they found some issue with your food safety practice, but they also were like, yeah, but the consumer was acting negligent themselves. They can split it. Not all states are like that, but Montana is. That being said, there is a concept of strict liability. So just to understand that if it's found that your product was inherently unsafe or contaminated when it left its source and is unreasonably dangerous or defective, then there's no kind of question of whether or not you were acting reasonable it's considered your liability. So this is particularly important with contamination issues. So if your food product is contaminated with E. coli, and you say, but I followed all the food safety practices, this comes to play a lot, unfortunately, in raw milk cases. So you can follow your best practices, but if there's found to be a contamination at the source, then commonly there's no question of whether or not you were doing what you should have done. It was contaminated. So again, just to stress, the Local Food Choice Act allows for exemptions for products from licensing, inspection, and regulation, but it does not change the standard by which liability is determined in cases of people getting sick. And it also doesn't change the DPHHS from investigating a food safety incident. So in the event that someone becomes ill and they claim that the food product came from you, doesn't matter if you made it under this law or not, they're going to investigate it just as if they would any other occurrence. And then it also doesn't stop an individual or an entity from claiming damages in a lawsuit. And I do want to point out one small thing here. So some of the most unfortunate examples when you hear about is like people that are like selling food to their neighbor understands like, oh, like I know that you were doing your best, and you know your produce still had something that made me sick on it, whatever. My neighbor would never sue me. It's important to understand often with physical damages that often the entity that's bringing the suit isn't necessarily the individual. It could be anyone involved in the payment of the damages. So quite often it's a medical insurance company. So if someone's hospitalized for a foodborne illness incident, it's not just the individual, but whoever paid their medical bills can also be part of the suit, and is more commonly the entity suing. So in managing liability, this is kind of the, I don't know, the three-legged stool of food safety liability. So food safety practices, your insurance, and then your business structure. Okay. Oh, Aaron, you might have to do a quick chat poll here. I don't actually have a poll, but people want to guess what's the annual occurrence of foodborne illness in the United States? Tell me what you.
Quick poll. Want me to?
You have to. Oh no, don't worry about it. Just get the summary of what most answers are.
2 votes for A so far out of 25 people. Let's see your votes, everybody. One vote for B. 2 votes for B. Oh, it's a tie, A versus B.
Okay. Aaron, you know the right answer, don't you?
I think I do.
B. So 1 in 6 people, that's higher than I thought it was. And then here's another question. Where do you guys think it comes from? Most often. Aaron, do you see a trend?
Most people are saying A.
Okay. So it's actually B. So most foodborne illness, and a lot of it's probably actually underreported to, comes from our own kitchens. So it's cross-contamination in the kitchen, it's time and temperature issues, it's holding food longer than safe, etc. So I think there's like an incorrect assumption that, oh, we just get sick from people that are not clean in restaurants. And and I think unfortunately the irony of this law is that we're forcing production in a situation that is actually high risk and in settings that are not intended to be producing large amounts of food for commercial use. So, so this is the quote from Farm Commons, which you'll find in the resources. I give you a bunch of information from them. They're a great resource specifically for ag law, and they also have good kind of recommendations for food producers and liability and insurance, et cetera. But, you know, when it comes down to it, the most important thing, if you're concerned about liability, is just making sure that you're producing safe food. And they, you know, food safety plan in place with records and documentation to prove that the plan was being implemented. So, you know, that's lawyer talk for, you got to be doing it well. And then when someone comes looking, you got to make sure that you can prove that you were doing things well. So the recommendation is, you know, review and create a food safety plan that's appropriate for your operation. Food safety planning is like, I don't know that anyone enjoys it. I'm sure there's a few people that do, and they probably studied it and are very good at it. But most people, it's like a necessary evil. So the idea is like, it doesn't always fit. It doesn't always fit for a home kitchen producer, but you got to think about it in the same way. So having training, a lot of times when we ask this of home producers, like, do you have any official training in food safety? It's sometimes surprisingly low. That can be as simple as a ServSafe class. There's food manufacturing courses that are focused on kind of home scale food producers, particularly some cottage food laws in other states require a food safety course that's specific for home production. So there are resources out there, and just the recommendation is that you assess your own knowledge and you make sure that you can't make safe food if you don't know what you're looking for. So if you don't understand your product or the way to systematically look for specific points that are going to introduce high risk, you know, like, I know that I have to cook this to a certain degrees, et cetera, or I know that in my flow of food, these are the 2 or 3 steps that I have to be really careful in order to make a safe food product. I encourage you to have procedures. So, you know, our industrialized food system, the one thing that it can sometimes, not all the time, obviously, get right is that things are so standardized that it's hard to mess them up. That's kind of the idea that you want in your own production as well, is that you do things in a way that you create habits and procedures that you are less likely to have an issue occur in your food. And then the verification and documentation is that idea that, like, you can say you were doing something, but if you don't have some level of documentation when an issue occurs, it's really hard to prove that you were doing something right. Does that mean that you have to time and temp every food item like you would in a industrial setting? You have to make that judgment call for your food item. But we just encourage you to make sure that you have some level of verification that you're doing things to best practice. Because again, you're the only person that's under this law, you're the only person that's ensuring that things are safe. I do want to point out, part of this project is Arrow has, oh gosh, we're in the final, can I say that? We're in the final stages of producing this document. So we took HACCP planning and good manufacturing practices and all the kind of jargony, crazy language around food safety and really tried to focus it on what a home kitchen producer would need to think about when making food under this setting. So this is a physical resource that will be available for free on Arrow's website, I would guess in probably the next couple of weeks, and I will make sure that it gets sent out to everyone at this workshop.
Sam, quick question.
Mhm.
Documentation. Could that look like a logbook, a picture? What might that look like in this setting?
You know, it's going to kind of depend upon your process and your food item. If you have a high risk food item, I would just encourage you to shoot for what folks are doing in a commercial setting. That being said, nothing's good if you don't do it. So, you know, if you're baking food product, if you're baking muffins and you know, it's not a high risk item, do you need to temp all your muffins? No. If you are producing a frosting that requires a cook step, something like that, I would, you know, do you produce daily? Do you produce weekly? If you do a weekly documentation, how many people are you going to have to think about if you come back and have an incident? So I'm not directly answering your question, but you know, the standard is every batch. I don't know that you need to do that. If you're making, if you're selling products once a week, like do it based on that production scale. In like food safety documentation, the real focus is on recall. So maybe think through that process. Like, okay, like what if I found out that there's salmonella in my cream cheese? Then I made these muffins. Like, how often would I need to be making sure that my refrigerator is a certain temperature, making sure that my transportation is cold storage, etc. So a logbook would be great, documenting as routinely as you can and to make it effective. Okay, so we have just a few more minutes to talk about the other major points. Insurance, again, it's a little bit, again, of a necessary evil, but just to understand some of the basics. So insurance, I think of it as like, if you're going to show up to a prize fight, you want to come with a boxer. Like, you know, basically, the most important thing about insurance is if you have a claim against your business or your product, insurance will pay for your defense. And then it will pay out damages based up to your policy limit. So it gives you resources to ensure that even the act of having a lawsuit brought against you doesn't bankrupt your entity. And often insurance will pay regardless of whether you were at fault. With some like minor exceptions, but just to know that it pays for your defense and it pays for damages against you. So an super important thing to know is that foodborne illness or food poisoning injury is often excluded in most business liability policies. So unless you have confirmed with your business or your insurance agent that you have coverage for foodborne illness, you can almost assume that it is not. So I would make the assumption that it's not and verify that it is. Foodborne illness incident, it can be included under some business liability policies, but it's commonly a specific endorsement. Or it's, you need to get what's called product liability insurance. So, and you just need to clarify with your agent and ask these specific questions. This is what I'm making, this is where I'm selling it. Unfortunately, business liability usually will cover like someone tripping at your place of business and not anything to do with your products. And then sometimes agents don't have experience with food products or in this realm, And I would just encourage you to shop around. So ask for a referral from your agent. Another good place to look for information is from trade associations, or ask sometimes your competitors are your best source of information. So if someone's making a food product that's like yours and you have a good relationship, just inquire about where they get their insurance and how they navigate that. Something to also be aware of is just thinking about additionally insured. So this is common if you are an ag producer and you have multiple different businesses connected to your property, or you are a producer of another product. Just thinking sometimes about how those two entities might overlap and what you might need to do to ensure that either entity isn't going to be held liable for the other entity's issues. And then to also be aware, oh yeah, additionally insured, sometimes if you don't own your property, you should speak to if you don't own your home or you don't own the location in which you're producing food, you should speak to your landlord or your homeowner about if they need to be named on the policy. And then another thing to be aware of is, like we've discussed, farmers markets, private farmers markets, I would say, preliminary understanding, can set their own standards on what kind of insurance is required of their vendors. So it's becoming more and more common that markets will require vendors to carry their own liability insurance, and might ask you for proof of insurance. And then the other,
yep. Sorry.
Nope, go ahead.
I'm not sure that you will answer this question. We can point Molly elsewhere, but do you know of any specific like liability insurance in Montana for raw milk specifically?
I do not, and it's not for lack of trying. I have asked every kind of major entity here if I can get recommendations on who to talk to, and I have not found anyone that will insure raw milk. There on the resource page, there is a couple of resources that you'll find listed. One of them is called Food Product Liability Insurance. It's called FLIP. I don't know. I think that they might be an exception. It's not a Montana company. I can't endorse their products at all. And you know, I think for your knowledge, Molly, I have also found as a non-producer, I can only get so far when I ask like a what if. So oftentimes, if I get any inclination of we might consider that, then it's kind of a full insurance review that I kind of can't go anywhere. So I would encourage you to again start with your primary insurance provider. And if they don't have a recommendation, I think the next place, and you'll find this in our resource notes, is to reach out to other raw milk organizations to get direction on that product.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. So real quick, the third leg of our liability stool is just to think about your business structure. So this is a simple thing that you can address as you start to grow, or maybe add a new product. So oftentimes when people start a business, they'll start as a sole proprietor. And just to be aware that in that instance, it's simple. The income comes straight through to you as an entity. There's no separate tax returns. There's no registration, et cetera. But in that instance, you are the business and your assets are one and the same. So in terms of liability, if you are found liable your personal assets are not protected from your business liability. It is fairly straightforward to initiate and shift a business into a corporation. There are some incurred expenses with taxing or filing separate taxes, minor issues with the registering with the state, but the benefit is that there's a bright line between you and your business. So any kind of fault that your business would have financially or legally would be separate from your personal assets. So real quick, we have done and will do a couple. So we did some raw milk trainings this past fall with some folks from California, the Raw Milk Institute. They were fabulous. I have resources from those training, and they are a continual resource if you have specific questions about raw milk production. The toolkit is available, and we this summer are going to do some training specific to food safety by product and focused on home production. So I will keep you informed on those. And then again, I want to highlight this. This is next week. Well, it's a two-part series. The first one being next week. It's in person in Missoula, but there's a virtual registration option as well. And again, this is through Mission West in Ronan. I will send you a whole bunch of resources with more information on a bunch of different topics. And then again, I invite people to reach back out and ask specific questions or for clarification. And again, I would anticipate hopefully in the next week or two, we'll be happy to just let you know what the DPHHS comes out with direction on any of the new amendments to the Local Food Choice Act. These are our sponsors, and we have time for some questions if anybody has them.
Thank you so much, Sam. Lots of gratitude coming in on the chat too. And I will just say, before you leave today, wait for our survey so that we can stay in good standing with our funders who help us do this for free. So one question though, before we get to that, Christine asks, I thought I saw catering as a part of this law. Can a home producer cater for income under the law? And could you speak to that?
Yeah, so it's a little bit tricky. So the way that I think the option that it allows for catering is making food that is going to be served at a community event. So the most like straightforward way would be, for instance, a wedding, someone making cakes. So wedding cakes in particular are something that folks have been making a lot. So again, you are making food, selling it to an entity that is serving it at a community event. When it gets a little bit more tricky, if you are like functioning as a caterer where you are in either a home or a commercial kitchen and you are going and you are serving food that is ready to be consumed, you're functioning as a caterer, and that's going to be going to cause probably some people to look into what you're doing. So I think there's probably some gray area in there. Can you make ready to eat meals that people then serve themselves? Yes, you got to make sure they don't have meat. They're, sold and made in all the other occurrences. But if you're making food for offsite prepping and offsite consumption, you're you should have a catering license.
Cool. I think that was clarifying. Christine said, got it. Thank you. Oh, interesting. The question has been brought up by clients who are considering catering for those experiencing houselessness. Yeah, very interesting, Christine. Happy to chat more too.
That'd be great. Yeah, I'll reach out, but just was curious. Thank you.
You bet. And no other questions in the chat so far. Okay, one more. Do you know if a home producer can sell a single ingredient frozen vegetable sides like frozen beets or squash, assuming you follow all the other rules?
Okay, so I don't see why you wouldn't be able to. You know, making sure obviously that it's temperature maintained through, I mean, just as a food safety practice, but yeah, and you know, you don't have to be the producer. You could buy the vegetables somewhere. Yeah.
Great.
Okay. I will send resources and slides and follow-up information to the emails that people registered under. If you don't get it or you have more other questions, feel free to contact me. And thanks for everybody's time, and thank you in advance for completing the survey.
And the survey is going out by email, Sam, is that right?
No, I think it comes up right on your web browser when I hit end.
Ah, there it goes. So thank you all.